I've always liked spiders. There's something about them, maybe it was the fact that it creeped out all the other kids on the playground when I was a child, or maybe it's the weird ways that they move. The fact that their legs basically function like mini hydraulics, or that they inspire terror in so many people. There was just always something terribly fascinating about them. So for this Inktober prompt, as I work through day 2, spiders, I wanted to instill that manner of idea, something scary, terrifying even. And as I started to work through this prompt, the idea of telling a story came to fruition. So this little girl is encountering something that Bilbo ran into in his adventures through the Mirkwood in The Hobbit. I find that anytime we can shove storytelling elements into our art, it makes it that much more entertaining for others and for ourselves. As I've been working through the prompts this year for Inktober, I've had more joy than I have in prior years. And I think this is largely due to the fact that after the first prompt, I immediately started telling a story with this little character. This little excuse for having something to show size and scale, which is the only reason that she came into this originally. As I've moved through other prompts, seeing as I'm recording this on day 5 of the month, I've begun to tell a story with this little character, and it's more entertaining for me. Greetings, and welcome to the session. My name is Zach, I'm an artist and an art teacher, and today I'm continuing to work on some Inktober prompts. I had some other stuff in my mind, some other things scheduled for this, but this is what I'm working on, and so it feels the most honest and authentic to show this to all of you. Today's prompt is spiders, and from the get-go I knew that I wanted to tell a story with this. I wanted to have something terrifying. I'm fortunate, maybe lucky, that my initial sketches came out well, and I had this kind of creepy, scary creature, but he's freaked out by this little lantern that this tiny little character is holding. I like telling stories with my artwork. In fact, I like telling stories with everything. I think that the thing that drew me into art originally was storytelling, whereas for others it might be different things. It might be just the coolness factor. For me, I always wanted to tell stories and wanted to show off different things about the world or worlds that I could create. Another huge benefit to this, though, is that spiders are hairy, and so I get to play with all kinds of texture. At this point on the drawing, I'm just kind of working out where everything's gonna go. I have a loose sketch, which I'm sure you can see, and I apologize for the sausage hanging in from the left side. That's from the other prompt. You can go check that video out if you want. It does look kind of hilarious having just a sausage and a chunk of meat intruding into our workspace here. I find it good to have a little sketch, though it's not always how I work. Sometimes I just dive in, and in fact, for sketchbook sessions, I will often just jump straight in with a ballpoint pen and see what happens. I think that's enjoyable. I think it's fun, it's low stress, and probably some of the next sessions will go back to that style, especially after putting so much time into the Inktober work, which is so regimented and so put together. It's really good for us, for you and me as artists, to branch out and to do things that are different than what we do all the time. Inktober is beneficial this way because it's predetermined prompts that we have to work through. But because I'm working on those kind of things, my soul is already starting to yearn for the random chaos of a normal sketchbook session. So I'm sure that next week's session will go back to being just a random drawing of whatever. And I'll probably dive into some more of those later on today as well, just to give my mind a break from this. I had a boss a long time ago that often used to say, if you're tired of reading a book, you don't put the book down and then grab another book. And I think that's true as well. Though sometimes you can get tired of drawing and jump into a different kind of drawing, you seldom jump into the same manner. If you're working on perspective drawing, it's very orderly, everything has its exact right spot. You're probably not going to put that down when you're tired of it and then go draw mechs. Speaking of mechs, I just finished my 3rd playthrough on Armored Core 6, which just came out a couple weeks ago. If you haven't given it a try, I would highly recommend it if you are into video games in any capacity. It's a really bleak world, and that's part of what made it so intriguing to me. You start on the first couple levels, and it's post-apocalyptic, but in a way that we don't often see. It's a little bit like early Star Wars, where you get this idea that the world has fallen apart, and we're just observing what has transpired through the eyes of somebody who's showing up and seeing this decayed world after the fact. These monolithic structures hang from the sky. There's a massive grid structure over the planet that you're on, and everything's just kind of dark and bleak. And I haven't played a mech game in years. I grew up playing Mech Warrior. In fact, the original Mech Warrior with my dad, who played it with his Air Force buddies over AOL dial-up. For those of you who are probably under the age of 25, that was back when internet literally took over a phone line in your house. So if somebody was using the internet, you couldn't simultaneously be on a phone call. It made these weird noises, which are still kind of haunt my dreams in some capacities. But my dad used to play online with his buddies, and he would wait till all of us had gone to sleep, because that way, I wouldn't interrupt it by trying to call someone, though my dad was calling anybody at like 7 or 8 years old. But it was a wonderful introduction to gaming for me when I was a young kid. And I loved the customization, the fact that you could play with so many different aspects of what your mech did, the kind of weapons that it had, the chassis that it took on. It was a really fun game because of that customization. And so Armored Core 6 brings a lot of that back into the fold for me. I get to see a lot of these same aspects in this game, in this modern game in 2023. That is a new version of something I played in 95? 28 years ago. Oh, I'm old. But I'm just happy to see more mech games coming out. I grew up with them. They were probably, along with Command and Conquer and Warcraft 1 and 2, the first things that got me into games in the first place. And that's where I started falling in love with storytelling and world building in general. This is back before I read The Hobbit, back before I read Lord of the Rings. It was these video games that started to get me so intrigued with how you can put a world together and you can tell stories through all of these other aspects. So we come to today, and this creepy spider, which now looks like it's wearing a bonnet because I have just sculpted out where I'm going to shade things. I get to do this kind of stuff today. I get to tell stories in different fashions. And a lot of that started from mechs. So ironically, I didn't intend for that to all connect, but it kind of connects in this lovely way. It is interesting to watch this playing back because as I sculpt in all of the areas of shadow, it looks really disconnected and odd. There can be some weird aspects to ink drawing like this as you fill in spaces, something that you can really skip when you're working on digital art. If this was digital, I could literally just turn the entire canvas black and then work on the whites from that to bring them forward. But on here, it looks like we've got a creepy Santa spider because it looks like he has a bonnet on his head. As I start to work through it, it'll all come into fruition, it'll make sense. But at this point, it's a little strange. Let's skip ahead a little bit. It's fun to watch, though. I have the idea in my head as I'm working on something like this. I know exactly where it's going to go, or at least I know exactly where I hope it's going to go. But as I watch back through it, as you look at it, take some solace in the fact that your drawings will often look much, much, much better at the end than they do in the middle. Drawings are actually a lot more forgiving this way. I often used to talk to my students about their paintings because paintings usually look terrible until they don't. That sounds a little funny, but let me explain. Paintings often look like garbled chaos as you start to plot everything in, especially if you work by building from large shapes down to small shapes, which is how I was taught when I was at university. If you actually work on building everything like you would with a drawing where you work in one area and you work it to a high level of detail, it won't function that way. But that's really a drawing strategy. It doesn't work nearly as well when you're working on painting. In fact, if you look at any of my digital paintings on this channel, you'll notice that I paint them just like a traditional painter would because that's how I'm trained. So they look really messy and awkward at first, and then eventually over time they hit this precipice. They go over this precipice and they start to look like what they're going to look like at the end. Drawings, on the other hand, are often discernible from the beginning. You can look at this when we're such a small percentage of the way through the piece and understand and have some kind of concept of what the final result is going to be. Painting is not always that reliable. It's often scarier, and in the midst of the piece, it looks like you have no idea what you're doing, which is not great for artists who often have a high level of self-doubt, who often wonder what they're doing and if they know what they're doing throughout the entire process. So painting can, if you're unprepared, hit you sideways. It's another reason why ink is such a wonderful, beautiful thing, because it's pretty unforgiving in that. As you put down marks, those marks are there. Those marks aren't going to bend. And that might sound like a terrible thing, a scary thing if you're starting with art or if you're starting with ink. But there's a security and a safety in knowing that a mark that you put down is there. It's permanent. And I would wager that subconsciously most of our minds then help us make more accurate marks because we can't erase things, because we can't fix things. As I plot out a painting, digital or otherwise, I always know in the back of my mind that I can fix whatever mistakes I make. Right now, as I work on this piece, I know that there is a small amount of fixing that can be done, but very little. And so I'm thinking about marks, and you'll see as I pull my hand back every once in a while, I take a moment and I think about what I'm going to do next. I have this weird quirk where I pull my pen off of the paper and I shift it slightly in my hand. And that's really just a quirk while I'm thinking and processing what I'm going to do next. And ink is wonderful for that. Sometimes it forces you to slow down and to think about what you're doing, to think about the next action you take. Is it the one you want to take? Do you know yet? Do you need to make another sketch on another sheet of paper? And all of that is wonderful. All of that is beneficial for you, for me as the artist. Everything that pushes you out of your normal when it comes to your art is a good thing. I mean, probably not, because, when you say everything or always, there's always going to be caveats, just like this statement has a caveat, I'm sure. I don't like speaking in absolutes. Well, actually, I do like speaking in absolutes because it sounds really dynamic and cinematic, but in reality, there are very few absolutes. So yes, I'm sure there are probably things that could go wrong there, but in reality, most of the time, getting out of your normal is going to be good for you. In fact, in another video I'm working on right now that will come out in the next couple weeks, one of the things I focus on is travel. That seeing the world from a different perspective, from a different country or a different state, if you live in the US, is often very good for your psyche, because we as humans have such a tendency to think that what we do, how we live, is how humans live, how people live. And I live in the center of the US, almost the absolute center. And the way we do things here is not normal by any stretch of the imagination. The way our life functions is not normal in the US, and it's not normal in the grand scope and scale of the world. I know that to some degree because I've traveled a bit. And so it's very, very good to get out of your norm, to do things that are different from what you normally do, to see the world differently than the world of your parents, or the world of your high school or your middle school or your college. The world is vast, and as artists who want to tell stories and build worlds and depict things, we need to experience other things, other cultures, other cuisines, other peoples. It's very important for storytelling, and it's important for giant spiders. It's always exciting to see the drawing come to fruition, to turn into what you envisioned it. I have to admit that a very large percentage of my drawings don't hit the level that I want them to. So I'm happy to see that this one, as I was working through it, it almost exactly achieved my purpose for it. I'm learning things and thinking about things as I go. The fact that I just had to add in that little shadow from the drip was something I didn't anticipate, but when I started working on a full-sized version of this, it made sense, and so I had to include it. As I continue to work through, I'm discovering things, I'm figuring things out, I'm making decisions. In this particular situation, trying to figure out exactly how many hairs to put in the light areas was pretty difficult. I had a hard time figuring out exactly how I wanted to approach that. Here, as I start to shade in some of the just random silhouette shapes back behind the spider, again, this was not something I anticipated. This is something that I decided in the midst of the drawing that would allow me to break up the negative space, to create some more interesting triangles and rectangles of negative space and black as it moves throughout the piece. I originally thought about shading in everything behind the spider, and I decided not to because the beautiful little hairs that are sticking out on the back of its body would no longer be visible. I don't necessarily have a good explanation for why it's super bright back behind the spider, but it doesn't really matter. It tells the story that I want it to. It makes sense. It's cohesive in and of itself. So the fact that that part doesn't necessarily make 100% sense is totally fine. I had also anticipated making lines for where the light was coming out of the lantern. I'm glad now that I didn't, because it's really apparent where the light is coming from because of how bright the spider's face is, how extreme the shading is behind it. And that's harder. That's something that I've only recently become comfortable with in my drawing and my storytelling. And so I'm happy that's turning out well. As always, thanks for watching and listening. I really appreciate it. I hope you have a great adventure in your artwork, and if you haven't dove into Inktober yet, I would highly encourage you to do so. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.